Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
On Easter morning, while the coffee was still doing its slow job of making everyone polite and the kitchen sounded like an orchestra of cabinet doors and serving spoons, my mom lifted a velvet box with the kind of flourish she usually saves for church fundraisers and anniversary toasts and announced, in that bright voice that tells you she has rehearsed the sentence for at least a week, that my sister Claire deserved the best because she worked so hard and carried so much, and then she clicked the hinge and held up a diamond bracelet that caught every eye at the table as if we were all supposed to clap on cue, and I swear even before she turned to me with a smaller, lighter box and that careful smile she uses when she is pretending to be fair, I felt my jaw tighten because I knew what was coming. I just did not know she would do it with an audience. She pressed the small box into my palm like a hostess passing a breath mint, and I noticed how everyone leaned in just a little, not because they expected fireworks, but because they were waiting for the contrast, the way you wait for a punchline you already know. And when I opened it and the tissue paper fell back, there was a breath in the room that changed temperature, a shift you can feel even if you are not looking up, because suddenly my mother's smile did something I had not seen since I was a teenager arguing about curfews. It twitched and thinned and then just flattened into a face that could not decide whether to be furious or terrified, and I knew right then that the thing in that box had done its work before I even said a word. I did not gasp or perform shock or pretend to be confused in that high voice Claire uses when a bill arrives and she wants someone else to handle it. I just let my eyebrows do a small climb and said, as politely as I could, "Well, this is not what I expected." And I could feel the room tilt toward me, forks pausing, napkins hovering, that quiet buzzing noise families make when a script goes off the rails, and my mother shot me a look that carried a full paragraph of instructions, the first line being put the lid back on, and the second being we will discuss this later, and the third being do not you dare make a scene in front of your aunts. Here is the part you need to understand, because without it, the next steps sound petty when they are not petty at all. They are the final straw stacked on a lifetime of little cuts that always bled only on my side of the table. I grew up learning that Claire's disappointments were emergencies and my achievements were housekeeping, that Claire's tears were weather and my feelings were clutter, that my mother's love was a spotlight with fixed settings that somehow never landed on me unless I was holding a broom or a casserole dish or a solution, and there is a kind of exhaustion that builds when you realize you could run a marathon and it would be described as you keeping busy while Claire took a well-deserved nap. So when I looked down into that box and saw the thing that made my mother's face pale, I did not scream or storm out. I did something worse in our family. I stayed very calm and I asked her out loud, not loudly but with intent, if she wanted to explain why the gift meant for me had turned into something that did not look like a gift at all, and the way her eyes flicked toward the bracelet on Claire's wrist told me that she understood the stakes and also that she had no quick story to cover this. No tidy little tale about mix-ups at the store or shipping mistakes or clerks with the wrong receipt, because this was not something a clerk could fix even if you walked in with a manager and a signed note from the Pope. Claire, bless her selective curiosity, leaned over and tried to peek, still admiring her new bracelet with the other hand. And I rotated the box just enough for the cousins closest to me to catch a glimpse while keeping it away from the people who would immediately start managing. The way certain relatives manage grief by organizing casseroles and certain relatives manage conflict by changing the subject to home renovations. I wanted the first ripples to be private enough to be undeniable and public enough to be irreversible, and as soon as my Aunt Patty's eyebrows shot up in a way that made her husband sit straighter without knowing why, I closed the lid with all the gentleness I have practiced for years and said, "I think I will hold on to this, thanks." My mother cleared her throat and tried to steer the attention back to Claire's wrist, asking if everyone could see the clasp, because the clasp was special, handset, she said. And I smiled the kind of smile you give a telemarketer who keeps talking after you have said no twice. Then I turned to my cousin Maya and asked if she could pass me her phone for a second, because mine was charging in the living room, which was true. And also because I wanted to send one message without the family group text lighting up like a pinball machine, and Maya slid it across the table with a look that said she had already figured out more than she let on. People think revenge is loud, but in my life the only revenge that ever mattered was the kind that looks like a boundary enforced in public, the kind that says I am not going to absorb this one quietly so you can pretend it was never said or done. And while my mother directed everyone to take a look at the engraved clasp and told the story of how she picked it out because it reminded her of Claire's resilience, which is a word she uses when Claire survives consequences other people absorbed for her, I typed a short note to myself and a backup to the person who would understand exactly why I needed it and when it should go out. Then I handed the phone back and lifted my glass and said cheers to fairness, which made 3 people laugh because they thought I was making a joke and 1 person choke because she knew I was not. What I did next was small and looked polite, but it was the first strike in a fight I had avoided for years. I stood and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. And as I moved behind my mother's chair, I set the little box on the buffet table where people park their purses and phones and keys, where things get touched without permission all the time, and where curious hands do what rules do not. And I knew it would not take long before someone who was not me would lift that lid and start the kind of whisper that cannot be put back in its container, not today, not next week, not ever. By the time I returned to my seat, my mother's color had not so much returned as it had been painted back on by sheer will, and she leaned toward me with a voice that belonged in a dentist's office and said, "We will talk privately in the pantry in 5 minutes." And before I could answer, my cousin Maya's knee bumped mine under the table and she murmured without moving her lips, "Did you put that in there on purpose?" And I met her eyes for one long second, took a slow breath that did not look like a breath at all, and said, "Not yet." If you have ever lived in a house where the scoreboard was invisible, but everyone knew the numbers anyway, you understand how quiet resentment can grow into something that does not shout, but still fills every corner, and that was our family's specialty. Because for as long as I can remember, Claire's crises were treated like national emergencies that required a committee and a budget, while my milestones were treated like errands that could be squeezed in between a dentist appointment and picking up a sheet cake, and I kept telling myself that this is just how some mothers are. They pick a favorite and then backfill the logic, except that logic stretched over years turns into a story everyone thinks is true simply because it never gets challenged out loud. When I graduated, I watched my mother turn the conversation into Claire's workload at her internship and how she might not get the job offer because people did not appreciate her spark, and when I got engaged, my mother announced that Claire had just had her heart broken and needed to feel special, so we would keep it low-key, which meant a small dinner and a stack of paper plates and a promise to do something bigger later that never came. And when my engagement ended, because I finally realized I was the only one doing the emotional labor for both of us, my mother did not offer comfort so much as a critique about my expectations, as if asking to be chosen in my own relationship was a branding problem I should research on my own time. Meanwhile, Claire's smallest effort was called grit and her biggest messes were relabeled learning curves, and I learned to be useful the way some people learn to be funny, because it made the room easier to be in. This is not me whining about gifts, because truly I can buy my own bracelets and my own coffee and my own floral centerpiece if a table looks bare. This is me telling you that Easter morning was not about jewelry. It was about a public declaration that Claire deserves the best and the implied footnote that I deserved whatever was left, and the small box in my hand was supposed to be a cute afterthought that would let my mother claim fairness, while everyone nodded along. Instead, it opened a door she has kept deadbolt for years, and what made her face pale was not a misunderstanding, it was recognition, because the thing inside that box was not new to her. It was only newly visible to the people she counts on to keep her version of events in place. When she told me to meet her in the pantry, I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the one that says be reasonable, do not make a scene, protect her feelings because she is your mother, and I nearly stood up out of habit. The same habit that has me clearing plates before dessert and apologizing for silence I did not cause. But then I remembered that every private talk we have ever had about family fairness has ended with me accepting a smaller plate and promising to be grateful for it, so I looked at the buffet table where the little box sat like a dare and I said, softly but clearly, I am happy to talk when Claire is there and when the box is on the table between us. And you can watch the room learn something about you when you say a sentence like that to a woman who has always managed optics like a professional. She blinked twice and tried to smile, because she knows how to switch to customer service mode when she needs time to think, and Claire, who has never loved being excluded from a conversation that has her name anywhere near it, said fine, let's just get it over with. Which sounded brave and also like someone who still believed there was a version of this where Mom controlled the story by speaking faster than anyone else, and I told Maya to keep an eye on the buffet, which she did with a look. That said, she has been waiting for this play to happen since we were teenagers. In the pantry doorway, my mother whispered that I was being dramatic and that this was not the time or the place, and that she had every right to celebrate Claire because Claire had had a hard year. Which is a phrase used so often in our family it might as well be printed on dish towels, and I said I agree this is not the time for drama, which is exactly why we are going to do this with the box open and the words plain and no side conversations or spin. And Claire, impatient and already bored, said what even is in there, a coupon, a joke, what, and I said, if it is a joke, you will not mind hearing it out loud. Before I stepped fully into the pantry, I pulled my phone from my pocket, not to be slick but to be fair, and set it on the shelf with the voice memo screen open and said, for accuracy. Because I know how memory tends to get creative in this family when the stakes are inconvenient, and my mother stiffened in that way that says she is calculating risk. And she told me to put the phone away because we do not record family conversations like depositions, and I said then let's have a family conversation, not a private one that becomes a different story by dinner. Here is where I will admit something uncomfortable, because honesty matters if you want the ending to feel deserved. I did not stumble into this moment by accident, and, while I did not plant anything in that box this morning, I have been collecting the kind of facts that do not evaporate when someone raises their voice, and I knew there would be a day when I would need them, not to ruin anyone but to stop being treated like a bonus track on an album where Claire is the single. And when I saw my mother's face at the table, I knew the day had arrived and that my job was not to blow it up. My job was to keep it steady enough that no one could pretend they misheard. So I told my mother that the pantry talk could happen with the door open and the box present and Claire listening, and that if she preferred to wait until after dessert, we could do that too. But I would not be walking into that little room alone to be told I was overreacting, and she finally nodded, tight and small, and said fine, but you will regret making a scene, and I said maybe. But I have regretted being quiet for longer than I care to admit, and I lifted the little box from the buffet, set it between us, and asked Claire to open it herself, since the bracelet had already had its moment. This is the part where you want me to tell you exactly what she saw, and believe me, I want to tell you, because holding it back makes me feel like I am teasing you on purpose, but there is a reason I am not going to say it yet. Because the meaning of what was in that box is bigger than the words on the page, and it only lands the way it needs to land when you see how the people in the room react, especially the ones who always thought they knew who was generous and who was jealous. So Claire lifted the lid with a sigh that said she expected a prank or a guilt trip. She looked down once, then again longer, and a muscle jumped in her jaw as she realized this was not a joke, and my mother reached out as if she could put the lid back on time itself. And I took one step back so everyone in the doorway could see what they needed to see without me saying a single accusatory word, because sometimes the fairest revenge is making the truth stand on its own feet and then refusing to carry it away for anyone. If I told you that Easter morning was the first time I had thought about drawing a line, I would be lying, because the truth is that lines do not appear out of nowhere. They are drawn slowly by a steady hand that has finally stopped shaking. And mine studied about the time I found the key taped to the back of my late grandmother's recipe book, the one she used to keep in the drawer everyone pretended not to open, because it also held things like old warranties and birthday candles and a roll of quarters for laundry. And on the key there was a small tag in her handwriting that simply said, "For the girls," which would have sounded sweet if I had not already learned what that phrase usually meant in our house, which was that Claire would get the front seat and I would get to hold the maps. I sat with that key for a week, not because I am sentimental but because I have learned that the fastest way to be called dramatic in this family is to move too quickly, so I wrote down the bank name, called the branch, and asked what would be required to access a box in my grandmother's name, and the woman on the phone was very gentle while she walked me through the process and checked the records and confirmed that yes, there was a safe deposit box, and yes, the authorized successors were listed as both granddaughters, which should have made me feel included, but instead made me feel like someone had handed me a fire extinguisher with instructions written in a language my mother did not allow in her house. When I finally went to the bank, I brought exactly what they had asked for and nothing else, because I did not want to look like a person on a mission, and when the clerk slid the metal drawer out and set the box on the small table, I had a moment where I thought I might be about to find old photos and a brooch and maybe a letter reminding us to take care of each other, which would have been sweet and unhelpful, but that is not what I found. What I found was a neat stack of envelopes with my grandmother's initials and a rubber band that had started to go soft with age, along with a small notebook full of line items that made me wonder how much my grandmother had known about who was taking what, and how long she had kept track, because she did not trust the stories being told at holiday dinners. I am not going to pretend I did not shake a little when I opened the first envelope and saw words that might as well have been a spotlight finally pointed at things that had lived in the dark, but I did not cry, and I did not call anyone. I did the one thing that has always protected me when people try to gaslight me about the past. I scanned and copied everything. Then I labeled the files with plain names and saved them in 3 places that are not in my home, because I was not going to let proof become a he said, she said when everyone knows the he in our family usually wears lipstick and organizes potlucks. In the notebook there were notes that connected years to decisions, and decisions to accounts, and accounts to the kind of generosity that shows up in public as a toast and in private as a balance transfer. And while I am not going to spell out every line right now because you deserve to feel the full weight of it when the last piece slides into place, I will say that what I held in that small stack was not gossip or rumor or a one-sided interpretation. It was quiet math that had been done and redone by a woman who believed in receipts more than she believed in speeches, and that math did not match the stories I had been fed about fairness and timing and who needed what the most. Once I had the copies, I did something that would make most people think I was overreacting if they did not know my mother the way I do. I mailed a set to my own address in a plain envelope with no return name. Because if you have ever watched a key piece of paper disappear from a kitchen drawer between breakfast and lunch, you learn to create a trail that does not depend on anyone's memory, and I also texted my cousin Maya, who is not just loyal to me but allergic to lies, and told her I needed her to hang on to something for when I ask, which is a phrase she has heard exactly once before, the year my mother tried to uninvite me from my own birthday dinner in order to make room for Claire's new +1. None of this would have mattered if I had not also considered timing, because timing is the part my mother counts on owning, the way she schedules praise and scolding so that only one sticks. So I set up a delayed send in the family group chat with a simple message that would go out later that day, not cruel and not dramatic, just clear and impossible to edit. A message that began with a toast to transparency and ended with a line about understanding how legacies work when the people at the table do not all get the same plate, and attached to that message I queued a single image that had been taken on my phone under good light with no glare. Because I wanted even the cousins who squint at their screens to see what they needed to see without asking for a better photo that could be withheld. People always want to know when the moment came that I decided to stop negotiating with people who never negotiated in good faith, and I think it was when my mother announced that Claire deserved the best. As if the rest of us existed to applaud that sentence, because there is a kind of exhaustion that turns into clarity when someone says the quiet part out loud. And the small box she handed me gave me a way to make sure the quiet part could not be shoved back into the pantry and sealed with a guilt trip and a promise to talk later. And yes, I placed the box where hands would open it and eyes would land and whispers would start. Because the only way to stop a lie that travels in private is to let the truth travel in public with the same speed and the same confidence and without apologizing for its volume. I want to be very clear here, because people love to pretend that exposing the truth is the same thing as cruelty. I did not set out to humiliate my mother. I set out to stop being humiliated for noticing patterns that were designed to disappear as soon as I looked directly at them, and if that means she had to feel the kind of heat she has always been able to redirect away from herself. Then I can live with that, especially since the plan I set in motion did not rely on me shouting or crying or flipping a table. It relied on me refusing to walk into a pantry alone and refusing to let a single sentence from her turn this into something small and forgettable. By the time Claire lifted the lid in the pantry doorway, and the air went heavy and my mother reached for the box like it was a fire I had started on her tablecloth, the delayed message I had scheduled sat in my outbox like a sealed envelope waiting for the clock to catch up, and Maya, who had not been told the details, but who has always been able to smell a thunderstorm before a single drop hits the patio, texted me one short line that made me feel steadier than any toast ever has. She wrote, "I've got you," and I stared at those words just long enough to remember that revenge, when it is clean, looks less like a strike and more like a sequence, and the next move in that sequence was about to arrive whether my mother liked it or not. There is a special kind of silence that happens when a family runs out of pretend, and I felt it spread from the pantry doorway to the dining room as Claire kept staring into the little box and my mother kept reaching for a lid that was no longer the solution. Because once enough people register the same truth with their own eyes, the old trick of "we'll discuss this later" stops working, and what takes its place is the slow calculation of what can still be controlled, which for my mother has always meant tone, setting, and timing. So when she tugged my sleeve and said we should step outside for a minute, I understood that we had entered the phase where she tries to buy privacy with urgency. And I said calmly that I would be happy to talk as soon as the message I scheduled goes out, and yes, I used that exact word, scheduled, because I wanted her to know that the clock had joined the conversation and that the outcome did not depend on my ability to hold my ground while she worked hers. I had taken the photo the day I opened the safe deposit box, not to be dramatic but to be accurate, because accuracy is what keeps stories from slipping into that fog where the loudest person wins, and I set the group message to send mid-afternoon, after people had finished eating and before they started driving home, which meant two things my mother would hate equally: that no one could claim hunger made them imagine things, and that everyone would still be near someone they trusted enough to say out loud what they had just learned. And while she tried to bargain by saying we could handle this like adults, which in our family has always meant the adult in charge tells the other adult to lower her voice, I reminded her that adults do not hide receipts in gift boxes and call it fairness, and that if she wanted her version recorded, she was welcome to write it down and send it to the same people who would be reading mine. The first ring came from an aunt who prides herself on mediating and who asked in that soft tone if I intended to embarrass my mother on a holiday, and I said gently that I did not intend to embarrass anyone. I intended to correct a public story with public proof, and that if embarrassment showed up, it could take a number and stand with the rest of us who have been embarrassed for years in smaller, quieter ways that nobody catalogued. And while my aunt tried to pivot to forgiveness and patience and the importance of family, I asked her to define those words without using me as the example of who should swallow them, which ended the call faster than I expected. Because it turns out forgiveness is easy to preach when someone else is doing all the forgiving. My cousin Maya, who has never been good at pretending she did not see what she saw, slid in next with a text that said the room is buzzing and also you look steady. And I told her that steady is just what it looks like when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to not hearing you, and she wrote back, "If she calls me I am going to say I saw it," and I said, "Only if she asks," because this is not about piling on, it is about ending the talent show where the truth has to sing louder than the lie to get a microphone. Claire finally found words and, in that tight voice she gets when the world stops arranging itself to her liking, asked me what my goal was, because she loves to discuss goals when she thinks a practical question will make me sound vindictive. And I told her my goal was simple and already in motion, that I wanted the people who keep repeating my mother's lines to hear mine without edits, and to see a single page that links decisions they applaud to consequences I have been told to stop noticing. She said that sounded like revenge, and I said it sounded like accounting, and that the only revenge in it was that I had chosen not to do the accounting in private where the numbers could be erased by dinner. My mother followed me into the hall with a plea I have heard in a dozen versions over a dozen years, that we should not ruin a holiday, that family matters belong in the family, that outsiders do not understand our context. And I reminded her that cousins and siblings and in-laws are not outsiders. They're the people she chose as witnesses when she staged a toast about deserving the best, and if she wanted privacy. The right time to want it was before she turned inequality into a performance. Not after the curtain rose and she discovered the prop in my box was not going to cooperate with the script. She said I was being cruel, and I said I was being clear, and that the difference only hurts when you are used to other people absorbing the blur for you. Because I have learned that follow-through matters more than declarations, I had already printed a copy of the same page and put it in an envelope with my own handwriting on the front, addressed to me at my apartment. Which means that even if someone decides to play the disappearing game later, there will be a postmarked twin I can hold up without saying a word. And for good measure, I had emailed another copy to myself with a subject line so dull no one would ever bother to open it if they stumbled into my inbox, and I did all of that not because I expect sabotage, but because I grew up in a house where stories get tidied and corners get rounded, and then people look at you like you are unwell for remembering the sharp edge they misplaced. By the time dessert appeared, the message timer had less than an hour left, and I could feel the way people rearranged their plans without admitting it. How the cousins reached for their phones more often and the uncles got quieter and the aunts started washing already clean bowls just to have a reason to be near whoever might have the latest whisper, and in the middle of that soft scramble, my mother touched my arm and said, "We can fix this if you give me time," and I told her that time was the one thing I was done giving without return, that I had spent years lending time and patience and attention at zero interest while she invested only in Claire and called it strategy, and that from now on, if she wanted to fix something, she could do it in daylight with a paper trail and witnesses who do not owe her silence. Her final play was the one I knew was coming. The appeal to love, the insistence that mothers are human and make mistakes and that the ledger of motherhood cannot be reduced to a single page, and I told her I agreed completely, that the ledger is long. Which is exactly why I stopped trying to carry it by myself, and that a single page was only the start, a clean page with clean numbers that would not be reinterpreted by tone or tears, and then I checked my phone and saw the timer cross the point where I had set the send to be irreversible. A small mechanical mercy that released me from the job of being the messenger one more time, and I looked at her and said, "We are going to let the truth arrive like dessert, on its own tray, to every table at once." She stared at me the way people stare at a locked door they used to open with a push, and for a second I almost reached for the handle out of habit, but Maya's hand found my elbow and steadied it with that quiet pressure that says, "Do not undo yourself now." And in the distance, I heard the first buzz of phones receiving something at the same time, a polite chorus that did not care about family rank or seniority, and my mother's phone lit up with the same preview as everyone else's, the same unedited image, the same simple caption, and she whispered my name like a warning and a plea at once, but there was nothing to warn and nothing to plead, because the message had already gone. And the only thing left to decide was whether she would finally speak to me like a person who had been there all along instead of a prop who knows when to clap. When the phones chimed and the room took that collective breath people take when they realize the story they have been carrying is about to get heavier, I watched my mother read the caption I had kept plain on purpose, and then open the image that did not need my voice to make its point, because there, clear as a light bill and twice as undeniable, was a photocopy of the deed transfer from the small piece of family land my grandmother had always described as for the girls, signed by my mother 2 summers ago and recorded a week later, with the sales proceeds wired into an account ending in the same 4 letters as Claire's little company that everyone praised as if it had been built from scrappy brilliance and not from a checking account that had been quietly drained, and next to it, on the same photo, because I wanted anyone with eyes to see the connection without a lecture, was a page from my grandmother's notebook, dated and tidy, where she wrote in her careful hand that the land was to be sold only if both granddaughters agreed, and that the proceeds were to be split equally and placed in separate accounts to avoid confusion. That last word underlined twice, like she already knew what would happen if the instructions were not written in ink. My mother did not cry, because crying would have confirmed something she wanted to keep deniable, and she did not shout, because shouting would have made the cousins pick sides faster than she could spin. She just said my name in that cool tone that has always meant I am being unreasonable, and she told the room that this was complicated, that Grandma had changed her mind verbally, that the land was not as valuable as the old tax assessment made it look, that Claire needed a leg up and I had said I was stable, which she decided meant I did not need my share immediately, and she was working on making it right, which is a phrase that has lived rent-free in my head for years and has never once resulted in fairness that did not come with a scolding attached. And I said to the table, not loudly but with a steadiness I have never had in that house, that I had already checked with the recorder's office and the bank, and that there was no addendum, no memo, no notarized change of intent. Only the deed and the wire and a handwritten ledger that showed a pattern of my mother calling favoritism strategy and calling love logistics. Claire started with a defense I could have written for her, that she did not know, that she thought the money was a loan from Mom's savings, that she believed the land plan had been postponed, not erased. And when I told her that the business account was opened 2 weeks before the deed closed and the first large deposit matched the number on the wire to the dollar, she swallowed hard and put her hand over the bracelet the way a kid covers a test they did not study for. And she whispered that she would pay me back, which is a sweet sentence that means nothing without a plan, and I told her I did not want a promise whispered in a pantry. I wanted a record, and that is why the message she was reading was not the only thing I had scheduled for that afternoon. At the same moment the group text went out. An email from my personal account landed in my mother's inbox, in Claire's inbox, and copied to the cousins who always get asked to remember things selectively, and in it I did not threaten or perform. I just attached a formal request for an accounting of estate assets tied to the land described by parcel number and date, with the words from the notebook transcribed plainly, and I set a deadline for a response that any adult would recognize as fair. And I included the name of the estate attorney who prepared my grandmother's will, a man I had already spoken with on a calm weekday afternoon when no one was bleeding, whose reply, also attached, said in simple language that absent a written modification. The instruction in the notebook and the will controlled intention, which meant that whatever justifications my mother liked to give at dinner did not change what had been agreed on paper, and, while I did not CC a courtroom or a revenue office, I did not need to, because the subject line read request for formal accounting and the names on that line told anyone reading it that this would not be buried under dessert. My mother tried one last angle, the one where she reminds me that family reputations are fragile and that public fights do not heal private wounds, and I told her that I had not started a fight, I had ended a game, and that the only reputation at stake was the story she had written about herself as the fair mother who made hard choices for the greater good, and that the greater good is not greater when it always routes through Claire first, and I turned to my sister, who had gone pale in a different way than Mom, not from fear of being caught but from the dawning realization that the myth of her self-made success was built on money I was told to stop needing, and I said gently, because I meant it, that if she wanted to salvage any self-respect here, she could start by acknowledging the truth out loud, not to me but to the room, and she could take off the bracelet and set it on the table and say she would not wear something purchased with stolen fairness. Claire took a breath and then another one and then, in a voice that made my stomach ache because I could hear the little girl who never had to tell the whole truth learning how to do it at last, she said the money was wrong. That she had not asked where it came from because asking might have broken the spell, that she liked the praise more than she liked the mirror, and she unclasped the bracelet and placed it next to the little box like a prop at the end of a play, and she said she would liquidate a portion of the business to repay my half plus interest calculated from the date of the wire, and she would put it in an account in my name with no signature authority from Mom, and she would send the first transfer within a week. And she would ask the attorney to draft a written plan so there would be no confusion, and then she looked at me like she needed permission to be that honest, and I told her I did not give permission anymore, I accepted actions, and that if she did what she just said, I would accept it with the same formality she should have expected from the start. Here is the part people keep asking me about when I tell the story, the part where I either forgive or I go nuclear, and the truth is less dramatic and more satisfying than either. Because I did not raise my voice or throw a glass or make a scene for a video that would rack up views. I just walked to the buffet, picked up the bracelet, weighed it in my hand, and then handed it to my mother with a smile that was not unkind and said, "Enjoy it, because whatever it costs you now will not come out of my share," and I left it sitting there like a receipt printed in metal. And as I turned to help stack plates out of pure habit, I finally broke. I caught myself, and I sat down instead, letting the people who love tidying tidy without assigning me the role by default. In the days that followed, the transfers arrived exactly as promised, not because my mother had a change of heart, but because the paper trail made delays a risk she could not spin away. And the cousins who always thought I was sensitive learned that sensitive is just what it looks like when you tell the truth before it is convenient, and I did not post a victory lap or send a spiteful recap. I just sent one last message to the group saying the account is funded and the matter is closed on my end, and if anyone had questions, they could ask the attorney and not me, because for once I was not going to do the emotional labor of narrating fairness back into the room. People want a moral and I do not have one. Other than this simple rule I wish I had learned sooner, which is that sometimes the cleanest revenge is not punishment or spectacle or a dramatic exit. It is a quiet, public correction that refuses to be softened by the very people who benefit when you go gentle. And if you need one last line to carry with you, it is the one I left on Claire's voicemail after the wire cleared. A sentence so small it fits in a pocket and so sharp it cuts through years of noise. I told her, "Enjoy the bracelet's memory if you want to, because you already paid for it, and for once, so did I."